This is the Comics Alternative, episode 291, a publisher spotlight on Peow Studio. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Gwen, and we're two PhDs talking about comics.
That's right. And on this episode, we're going to do a publisher spotlight, this time on Peow Studio and their releases over the past year or so. But before we get into that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by those wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be anywhere from 20 to 35% off cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But occasionally, you can find discounts that go higher than that.
That's right, Derek. And this month with DCB Service, there are so many awesome bundles that are all 50% off. There's Halloween specials, Books of Magic, #1, only $1.99. There's the new Nancy Drew for 50% off. I'm following that series, as you might imagine, because that's my kind of thing. But there's all sorts of wonderful comics that you can get this month at really deep discount.
That's right. You really can't beat the discounts at Discount Comic Book Service, if for no other reason. Discount is in their name. That's dcbservice.com. You got to go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please send them an email and tell them that Gwen and Derek sent you. So, Gwen, how are things going with you?
Really busy, Derek. This is the second week, technically, of the start of my semester, but we have a new calendar that we're following now where we actually start in August. So technically, I feel like it's the first week of classes, empirically, but physically it definitely is the second week of classes. And tonight, actually, I'm guest lecturing in a colleague's class. He's teaching a 6,000 level seminar on the literature of World War I, and I convinced him to begin the semester with a review of comics that focus on World War I, and his students have actually read Nathan Hale's Treacherous Tales, Treaties, Trenches, Mud, and Blood, but we're also
that's a great
looking,
one, yeah.
We're going to be looking at Jack Tardy and Joe Sacco's comics as well. So tonight I get to guest lecture on comics in a colleague's class, and I've actually convinced a colleague that comics should be part of his instruction. So yay.
Good. Okay, let's get into the heart and soul of this episode. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to be looking at recent releases, relatively recent releases from Peow Studio, a publisher spotlight. Every now and again, we do these publisher spotlights. You know, I think the last one we did, Gwen, Paul and I, about 2, maybe 3 months ago, did a publisher spotlight on the spring releases from Koyama. Mm-hmm. It's not often that we do publisher spotlights, but when we do, it's always interesting because the purpose behind our publisher spotlight episodes is to not just look at individual texts in detail. I mean, we could do some of that, but it's getting a larger sense of what a publisher is doing, maybe at a particular time for maybe their fall, winter releases or spring, summer releases, or maybe even their year releases. I know that earlier this year, Gene and I did a publisher spotlight on the small Latvian press, Kush, where we looked at their releases from last year. And so actually we're going to do something similar with Peow Studio this year, or on this episode, because we're going to be looking at primarily texts that came out last year, but even going into the late part of 2016. And what I'm going to do now is give a quick rundown of the various texts that we can discuss and we may discuss in more detail, but we're definitely covering in one form or another. Now, in 2016, they published Internal Affair, and this is by Patrick Crotty. And Patrick Crotty is also one of the masterminds behind Peow Studio. Their 2017 spring-summer releases, the book Ripple by Wei Wei Pang, Rule Break by Anya Syvertsson, Dust Pam by Thu Tran, Salmon Run by Mackenzie Schubert, and then their 2017 fall-winter releases, Stages of Rot by Linnea Sterte, Hot Summer Nights by Freddy Carrasco, and I believe that was nominated for an Ignatz Award this year. 310 by Mushbuh. I guess that's how you pronounce the name.
I love that.
Devil Maybe Cry by Patrick Crotty, Yuri on Evangelion by Patrick Crotty. And then their spring-summer releases of this year, we're going to look at Dark Angels of Darkness by Al Gofa. And then an early fall-winter release, Junky by Guillaume Singelin. And I'm probably butchering that name. So again, we probably won't talk about each of these texts, definitely won't have the time to talk about each of these texts in detail. But again, the purpose behind these publisher spotlights is to take a broader view and to get a sense of what a publisher is doing. And, you know, Gwen, when we have done publisher spotlight episodes in the past, more times than not, they've been with publishers whose output, how do I put this? I guess it's more traditional in terms of narrative and in terms of art to some degree. But this is a little different. We haven't really done anything like this before. I guess the closest thing is when Gene and I did the show, the publisher spotlight on Kush earlier this year. But, you know, actually the kind of comics that Peow Studio comes out with, I think in some ways is very similar to what we see coming out from Kush, a Latvian publisher. And Peow is out of Sweden. But it also reminds me of the stuff that we see coming from other very small presses like Youth in Decline and 2D Cloud. They do a lot of non-traditional experimental texts. And I think to a lesser degree, Koyama, although I would argue that Koyama is a little more conventional for the most part in terms of the comics that they put out. But Peow is definitely something that is very different and it's very out there. And I have to ask you, as we get started, now, had you heard of Peow Studio before I suggested we do this publisher spotlight?
No, I had not. And, you know, in preparation for it, I did read up on their history and their background, and it sounds like they remind me a lot of sort of an arts collective, really. They have a definite philosophy about the artifacts that they're creating. These are meant to be books that are held, and you have the paper copies. I only have the digital copies, so I feel a little bit at a disadvantage. Maybe you could talk a bit about what the texts actually look like, because it sounds like they went from a Rizzo printing process until just recently now they're doing offset printing so they can do more colors and it's more reliable. What do the books look like?
I think they're really nice. And in fact, you do have quite a bit of color, and you're right. They did change from the Rizzo format, and they come in a variety of different sizes and different shapes. Okay. And so I think it is more pleasurable to read them in physical form than it is in digital or PDF format. And, you know, I got copies from Peow Studio a while back. But the good people at Peow, in particular, Patrick, sent us all of these PDFs. And so we want to thank them for that. It allows us to do this show. Now, I was first introduced to Peow Studio, I think it was back in 2015, because two of their books were nominated for an Ignatz Award. And At the time, Andy Wolverton was helping me with the podcast, and he and I did an episode where we looked at those nominees for the Ignatz Award. And in particular, a book called Soft by Jane Mai was nominated, and I think it was for Best New Talent in that category. And then Patrick Crotty's Devil's Slice of Life, which we can reference.
I somehow remember that now that you've said it.
Was nominated in 2015 for an Ignatz in the Outstanding Minicomic category. And so I had gotten my hands on both of those, and that was my first introduction to Peow Studio. And then since then, I've been kind of keeping an eye, or at least a half eye, on what Peow has been doing. And it just occurred to me that, maybe this year at some point we could do a publisher spotlight on Peow. Got in touch with Patrick at Peow, and he helped us out here. So yeah, we're going to be looking at these books going from the tail end of 2016 into the first half of 2018. Now, again, if the purpose of a publisher spotlight is to give a general sense of the press, given your experience with Peow and these texts that they've come out with over the past year and a half, how would you define this publisher?
Well, I think it's a publisher that wants to give a lot of freedom to its creators. And as a result, if I'm actually looking at the covers of about 15, or I guess maybe 12 of these texts, and each one is different. And that's really significant to me because there are some publishers that have a house style, or at least they manufacture the covers and the exteriors of books in such a way that you can just glance at it and pretty much know which publisher it is. I would certainly say that, and I mean this in a positive way, of texts that come out of First Second, which is a publisher I work a lot with and use a lot. When I look at a cover, I can almost always tell you, okay, yeah, that came out with First Second. Whereas here, when I'm looking at these, each one is different, and I don't just mean in terms of color, I mean in terms of style, in terms of content. It's just really clearly a press that wants to put out the very best version of an author's work. And in some instances, this is translated work. And so I will say that every once in a while, there are some translations that maybe I'm thinking just from my own reading, maybe are not entirely consistent, or there's a little bit of a spelling issue here or there.
A little glitchy, yeah.
Yeah, so it definitely has that DIY feel to it. But each one in its own way is very visually powerful, and it's clear that they are selecting comics creators who are trying to break out of the norm, to do some real experimentation, and to play with both shape and color and format and message. And so it was really interesting when you suggested this, and I didn't really read them in any particular order other than what I thought looked most visually interesting to me. And after reading 3 of them, I realized I was reading 3 entirely different styles, very different narratives, very different flow. And so clearly, if you're interested in the experience of reading an eclectic work from an eclectic publisher, I think that would be a good adjective to use for Peow.
Right. And, maybe we can mention that just recently, they have brought on Zainab Akhtar,
right,
as editor. And if you don't know who Akhtar is, she is the blogger behind Comics and Cola, but she also has, the business now Shortbox, where not only does she package comics kind of like this, mini comics that are hard to find, experimental texts, but also publishes some of her own out of Shortbox.
Right. And she's, in interviews, she has said that it's very important for creators of color or for creators from underrepresented groups to get out there and to try to publish each other. And so the fact that Peow has brought her on board suggests that they really are trying to reach throughout the world and bring comics creators together from a variety of different backgrounds. And I think that's really exciting because, if I hadn't looked at these, some of these comics creators are from very different backgrounds, very different countries, very different places. And it's exciting to have access to all of those from one publisher.
Yeah, exactly. And so now she is an editor with Peow. And it seems that they are, I guess you could say, stepping up their game over the past couple of years. In other words, there seems to be more going on with Peow now than when I first learned about him a few years ago. And we can tell, I guess, here from the output. And, one of the things that you mentioned is that they do leave quite a bit of freedom to creators. There is some editorial oversight, but you have a variety of different styles, a variety of different storytelling styles, art styles, and even packaging. And so it just comes across as a place for people to do things that they wouldn't be able to do anywhere else. And I'll give you some examples of some of the differences that we have going on here. Because on the one hand, we have a relatively recent release. This came out during the spring-summer release season of this year. And that is Al Gofa's Dark Angels of Darkness. Even the title with its repetition is funny. But that is a funny book in many ways. But it is primarily a fight text. In other words, you have these individuals who are engaged in battle. And basically the premise is that you have this I guess, ruling figure named Imperious Ra. And it's RHAAA, and the A's have carrots over each of them. And basically, he rules over this place called the Barren Lands. And he has forbidden fusion. And this is going to sound weird, but again, these are the kind of texts that we have here, right? Quite experimental. Fusion is basically where a couple of individuals, a couple of warriors can come together and, literally come together to combine their powers. And in fact, at the very beginning of Dark Angels of Darkness, we see a couple of warriors kissing, and you kind of wonder, why are they kissing? Because they're about to fuse. And so that's the way that new warriors, more powerful warriors, can be created by fusion. But apparently Imperious Ra has forbidden this. And so there are several warriors that are wanting to fight back and to basically stick it to Imperious and also overturn his rule. And the mastermind behind this is a military leader by the name of Megan. Or Megan, Megan. I don't know if it's Megan or Megan.
Probably Megan, yeah.
Megan. And he and a small band of followers get together and they fuse. And, primarily Dark Angels of Darkness is one long fight scene or a series of fights. And so if you like that kind of narrative where there's a lot of action and a lot of fighting, and also quite a bit of humor, then this is definitely a text for you. Okay,
so Derek, I'm on this section where all of these like super type warriors are together, and one is called Rita Raider, and another is Slugger Andy and the Purge. But then there's this other guy standing here, and this one character says, "And who the hell is that guy?" And it says Steve. I don't know why I find that so funny, but this is really actually a funny text.
It is, yeah. And in fact, Steve is actually the result of a fusion. Right. And he's given another name. I can't remember what name that he's given after the fusion process, but he wants to be called Steve. Right.
I just love that. It's priceless. Sorry.
Yeah, it is. And the creator does have a great sense of humor. And by the way, the creator's name is Alex Goyen Fafard, but he goes by Al Gofa.
I thought you were going to see he went by Steve, which would be even better. But
no, he doesn't. Dang. So he basically, for his last name, at least on the cover, combines the first part of his middle name, Goyen, and the first part of his last name, Fafard. So Al Gafar. But this is a kind of text that's very different from another kind of text that we have here, and this is by Linnea Sterte, and I believe this is a Swedish creator, Stages of Rot.
Yeah.
And Stages of Rot is a very different kind of book, especially when set alongside Dark Angels of Darkness. Because if Dark Angels of Darkness is primarily defined as action and fighting, then Stages of Rot is something else entirely. Basically, what we have here as a premise is this, in this desert area, but to call it a desert area, it's not the kind of desert that we would recognize as a desert. This is a fantastical world, where you have creatures all over the place, and sometimes they're even like fish floating in the air, and flowers doing the same. So it's a kind of strange desert, but in this desert space, there is a whale who is that has died. And the story Stages of Rot is, as the title suggests, basically a coverage of what happens during the stages of rot of this whale and what kind of creatures, including humans, utilize or take advantage of or use the dying whale. And so you have humans who are apparently humans who are taking the flesh for their sustenance. And then you have mushrooms, you have plants, you have other creatures who are using the bones for their own, let's say, artistic expression. So, it's a very different kind of narrative. And to call it a narrative, I think, is kind of stretching it. I mean, there is a story there, but to me, one of the joys of Stages of Rot is the visuals. And you don't even have to understand what's going on in the story to appreciate what Sterte is doing. And you have these really lush images of what's going on during the various stages of decomposition or of individuals or creatures using or utilizing or drawing sustenance from the whale. And so it's just a series of almost, how do I put this? Kind of a slower paced, even at times kind of somber series of images that again contrasts quite starkly with Al Gofa's Dark Angels of Darkness.
And it feels almost like an anthropological study in some ways as well, something like out of the 19th century. It's definitely melding a lot of different styles. That's what it feels like to me, at least. So it's beautiful to look at, even like you said, Derek. I mean, there's points where I was just like, hey, I don't know what the heck's going on here, but it's gorgeous.
Yeah. And I think that, if you sit down with this text, Stages of Rot, and you're trying to ferret out a coherent narrative, you may be frustrated, but that's not the way I think that we're supposed to approach this text.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I will also say the use of color is pretty stunning throughout this, and it's a almost washed out color.
Yeah, kind of a muted. Yeah,
and so like very often living creatures like spiders or flowers or things like that are very bright, but then these humanoid creatures are almost always sort of washed out and less centered in the narrative. And I think maybe that is it's interesting because, like, when someone goes on vacation and they send you home pictures, and for me sometimes, I hate to say this, but the pictures I find most interesting are the ones that no one is in. It's just the scenery, and it almost feels as if this text is making a commentary about how used we are to thinking of human beings within an ecosystem and looking at everything in relation to human beings. And this text, I think, encourages you to decenter the human in a number of ways. And so I thought it was fascinating. But again, as you said, very different than some of the other comics that are in this, from this publisher.
Another kind of comic that we see occasionally coming out from Peow Studio, and we have at least two, if not more, examples of this in the batch that we're looking at on this episode, and that is comics where there is a coherent and apparent narrative, right? There is a story to be told, but it's rather ridiculous and over the top. And two that I'm thinking of in particular are Mushbuh's 310 and Tran's Dustpan.
Yeah, I have to say 310 if you're a graduate student, if you've ever been to grad school, if you've ever been a poor graduate student, and you've been trying to get someone to sort of push through your dissertation and get the heck out, this will have resonance because it ostensibly focuses on someone who's in grad school for archaeology but doesn't want to go on a dig. And so tries to convince her professor in the academy that taking stuff that she's found using a Geiger counter or just being outdoors and collecting it together would be of deep interest to people maybe 3,000 years from then. So why not do an exhibit now and be like futuristic about it? And she actually gets a grant for it, which is so. I mean, that's highly satiric, and the style is very much of the sort of DIY, sort of what you expect from people who are just sort of learning how to draw online with comics. I mean, it's the comics creator is very, very sophisticated. I don't mean that the drawings aren't sophisticated, but it uses mainly primary colors, and the drawings are like what you would do with an electronic pencil. They're,
Yeah. Or it looks like something that, if you remember the old program Microsoft Paint, MS Paint.
Thank you. I was trying to actually remember the name of it. And I Photoshop kept coming to mind, but I know it wasn't Photoshop. Yes, that's exactly.
That's a little more sophisticated. Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
But yeah, this book by Mushbuh it has that kind of amateurish MS Paint feel to it. And things are drawn in that way. Even the dialogue is, I think, parallels the art in that there are times where things are pointed out that are kind of obvious. And at times we have in the text the voice of the protagonist who becomes the narrator. But at other times we get text that basically is descriptive as to what a particular object is that we're looking at. Or even dialogue at times, obviously. So, I mean, it really is a strange work.
It's like South Park and Chris Ware had mashed up and created this.
It's like what now? Chris Ware?
South Park and Chris Ware, if they mashed up, would create this.
Yeah, okay, that's an interesting way of putting it. And so the main storyline is what Gwen pointed out. You have this graduate student who's a little lazy. She's studying archaeology, but she doesn't want to go on any digs. She collects everyday items that you would find, in our lives, like, for instance, a button or a tin can or something like that. And she's trying to pass this off as, future archaeological finds. And so then that becomes an important part of the story. But then along the way, she has, a series of things happen to her. She actually does find, by chance near her hardware store, this object that is really old. And then she definitely becomes the part of a dig against her, I guess, will. And she has an accident. She's hit by a car. She's in the hospital. There's issues with her green jacket. There are fantasy scenes toward the end of the book. It gets really wild.
It does. But throughout all of it, it's pretty funny. There's a lot of jokey humor.
Yeah. And, we get something similar going on with Tran's Dustpan. Okay, this is going to sound weird. The protagonist...
Okay, Derek, on this show, I think that's okay.
Okay, yeah. Okay, the protagonist is Dustpan, from the title. It's a cat-like dustpan named Pam. And Pam... her job and her passion is basically to sweep up dust. And not only at work, because she works at a particular place, but also in her home. And one of the reasons why she wants to sweep up the dust is to keep the bugs and spiders at bay. And some of this story is devoted to the joy that the various bugs like roaches and whatnot, and the spiders definitely, get in garbage. And so not just the dust, but also the stuff that goes into the garbage can. And in fact, I think they call it trash tower, which is, a terrace tower. Which is basically a large trash can that the bugs see in some kind of godlike way. And if they can get up there and inside, then, all will be nirvana for them. But of course, Pam doesn't want to have any of that. She wants to get rid of the dirt, the dust, the garbage, and the bugs. Along the way, she ends up babysitting for her boss. And the two kids that she babysits, I guess they're two fluffy dusters. At least they seem to be that way. And then there are a couple of her friends who are also helping to clean up during the story. So it's really strange. But again, that could go without being said for this episode, in that you have a story of this cat-like dustpan trying to get rid of dust and garbage because it attracts bugs, and Pam wants to get rid of those bugs.
And the color scheme is interesting. It's teal, yellow, and salmon for the colors. And the story that you're telling, I mean, it's so fascinatingly drawn, and these colors are so bright and cheerful. And I just love how, like, at various intervals in the text, these bugs show up and have these sort of little monologues.
They're kind of like a Greek chorus at times.
They are. It's hysterical. So, I mean, already anyone listening to this through here has come to realize that these really are artist-driven projects, and really passion projects, I think, for the artists. And therefore, you can really have a lot of variety in the same house. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah. And just some of the names of some of these characters. I mean, there's Dust Pam. There is a colleague of hers called Moon Broom. There's a vacuum, of course, called Vacky. The boss of Dust Pam is called Janet, and Janet seems to be this mop, I guess. And then another one of their colleagues is Garbage Bags. In fact, there are multiple garbage bags, because one is used, tossed, and then another garbage bag, becomes their colleague. So again, it sounds strange. It is strange, but it's a fascinating read. And again, one of the joys of looking at these comics from Peow is just to see the kind of wide range of narratives of comics that they publish, and how they let their creators do just a variety of different things, express themselves in multiple ways.
Well, also, we can't leave the discussion of this comic without pointing out that Janet's name is spelled Janit, short for janitor, I'm assuming. Yeah. And this, if you want to feel really guilty about not cleaning your house, I would recommend this comic. That was my basic response.
But we have other kind of wacky stories, if you want to call them that, going on at the same time. And there are a few contributions that we're looking at on this episode from Patrick Crotty, again, who's one of the people behind Peow Studio. And those books are Internal Affairs, Devil Maybe Cry, and Yuri on Evangelion. Now, the earlier one, Internal Affair, it's different. Of course, all of these are different. I got to quit saying that. In that, basically, you have this young character by the name of Onion, who has a head that's an onion, right? And in fact, at one point, his face gets cut, and one of his colleagues is crying because cut onions make him or her cry.
Right.
So anyway, he is an unpaid intern at this company called, I can't remember what the company's called, but it's one of these high-tech companies like, Bennervelt. And it's something like an Apple or a Microsoft. And
right.
So Onion is working there, and he's grumbling because he's unpaid and he's just an intern. Toward the beginning of the narrative, we learn that he has, stopped someone who was trying to infiltrate and steal from Banvelt. And so his eye is injured. He becomes a hero. And as a result, he becomes an employee intern, I guess. Still an intern, but now an employee. So I guess he's getting paid with the company Bannervelt. But then what happens is a couple of other interns are brought on, and then the employees proper, not the interns, go off on a retreat, and they leave the shop, so to speak, in charge of the interns. And Onion's boss calls him at one point and says, "We have a problem. Their competition is basically about to launch a program that will really undermine what Bannervelt is doing." And so the boss tells Onion that what he has to do is to infiltrate this other company and get rid of whatever they have, like PowerPoints and whatnot, presentations that kind of glorify or advertise or publicize this new software that they're about to come out with. And so Onion contacts a freelancer, I guess a freelancer who does sneaky things. And so they go into the other business. And of course, most of the text is concerned with them going into this other company. And I can't remember that company's name. It starts with a D. Oh, God. I should have written this down. But it's the competition. And they try to get rid of the software and the presentation information. There's a confrontation with the boss of that company. They learn, and I don't want to give anything away here, but there are certain revelations at the end where Onion realizes that his situation with his current job isn't what he assumed it was. And so given what he learns, then he makes certain decisions. And so that's kind of there's definitely a storyline that goes, that you can discern. There are a lot of action scenes. One of the things I noted about Crotty's style is that it's heavily influenced by manga. And not just the way that he illustrates figures, but also action scenes, especially. So, for instance, there's several action scenes in Internal Affairs where you see those kind of action lines and movement lines that are reminiscent of what you find in manga. But you can also see some of this same manga influence on a couple of the other works that Crotty has that we're looking at on this episode, and that is Yuri on Evangelion and Devil Maybe Cry. Now, Yuri on Evangelion, I'm still trying to wrap my brain around it. It deals with ice skating, and I'll just read you the blurb on the back of the book. It says, in the year 2015, mankind faces a threat unlike anything else, the Angels. Special Defense Agency NERV, N-E-R-V, has been battling the Angels, but when the Angel appears in the Arctic Circle, they are unable to battle on the icy landscape. Captain Misato Katsuguri reaches out to the world's best U-16 skater, Yuri Pletsky, to help pilot a specially designed ice skating EVA unit, EVA unit. Success rates for the mission are at a crushing low level, but it's the last-ditch effort that just might work if we get lucky. This is a relatively short narrative, and you do have Yuri and I can't remember his colleague's name, who go in, who are these figure skaters who are able to go in and battle Angel in the Arctic Circle. So, I mean, it does become wild, and you do have a similar kind of art style as you did with Internal Affair that, again, even more so, I think, in Yuri on Evangelion, seems to be much more manga influenced.
And I will say, I didn't have a copy of the second text, but it's It's interesting how, like, all of the characters in this text are talking about really high-tech stuff. Their jobs involve, software releases. There's all these different devices and gadgets. And yet the drawing style is like, if the Michelin Man sat down and was drawing, this is the kind of characters he would draw. It's this sort of like really light blue line through most of everything, and everyone's sort of round and squishy. And so it's so weird to have all this technology coming out of the mouth of this big round squishy onion. It's actually humorous and just really bizarre, but I actually find it kind of funny. It's sort of like Dilbert, only like with big squishy manga characters.
You're talking about Internal Affairs?
Yeah. It reminds me a little of Dilbert, even though I'm not particularly fond of that comics creator. But that idea of like The Office or whatever, it has that feel of, on the one hand, sort of, sort of satirizing the work environment, like when the boss talks about the interns and he trusts them 100% as much as the paid employees, and it just has that feel of The Office, but then it's like a bunch of onions talking. I don't know, I found the juxtaposition amusing.
Right, onion, there's a tomato, there's an eggplant.
Yeah. I like the eggplant, because the top of the eggplant is like its hair, and it really gives him a nice mop of hair there. It's pretty funny.
Yeah. Now, the other contribution from Patrick Crotty is Devil Maybe Cry, and this is different. This is a kind of a combination of what Crotty had done previously with his book that came out in 2015, I think, Devil's Slice of Life that I mentioned earlier, and the video game Devil Maybe Cry. Now, I'm not a big gamer. I mean, I recognize game titles, but I don't know Devil Maybe Cry. Had you heard of that before?
No.
Okay. And, it says on the inside front cover, this book is a special crossover event comic Peow had on their website in early 2017. It follows Devil, the character from Devil's Slice of Life, but the comic also featured BB, Addie, two characters created by Chris Mukai, and Dante from that video game Devil May Cry. And I looked it up, and on Wikipedia, yeah, Devil May Cry was a video game a number of years ago. And so what Devil Maybe Cry is doing is it's kind of using Devil May Cry as a springboard along with the character Devil from the earlier book, Devil's Slice of Life. And in essence, you have, I guess, a pursuit narrative. Dante, he kidnaps Addie, and BB needs to find Addie. And so BB conjures Devil. And so BB and Devil go in search of Dante, who has Addie, so they can free Addie. And then they eventually find Addie. I mean, and there are other minor characters along the way, but those are the major ones. And so that's basically what you have in Devil Maybe Cry. So, I mean, again, there's a discernible narrative there. It's just a little unusual. It's a little wacky. And you can tell that Crotty is really using his imagination here, especially in terms of tapping into his previous character from Devil's Slice of Life, Devil.
And at the beginning, it kind of, it's interesting because, first of all, there's a little tag that says this book belongs to, with a little line. And so it's sort of, it adds to that sort of verisimilitude and kiddiness, because it says, this means I can do whatever I want with this book because it's mine, except I'm not allowed to reproduce or transmit any portion of this book without the consent of either. And then it's like these little lines, and it looks like someone's written it in with, like, maybe a fourth grader's penmanship, Patrick Crotty or Chris Mukai, or the publisher. And there's another line, and it's written in Peow. And it's really cute because then there's a little timeline that talks about the video game and about all the influences that come together to create this fanzine, as they call it. So it definitely has that DIY feel to it, I think very intentionally. And that part of it I thought was pretty cute.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in the back of the book, there is, I guess, kind of an extra bonus story by Chris Mukai, BB Under the Leaves. And so basically it's the character BB who is under leaves, who finds this walnut, and a squirrel takes it.
The end.
Yeah, exactly. And even in the back where you have these character sketches, Crotty calls this Devil Maybe Cry bonus DVD content. So,
this is the kind of publisher where you'd really like to go hang out in their office, because that the offices of this publisher are amusing. I have to say that probably just the stuff that's on everybody's desk would be amusing. There's a feel here of people who are having a really good time.
Right. Now, and you can tell me if I'm off base here, but I think one of the most, traditional texts that we have in this collection is Anna Syvertsson's Rule Break. And this is a series of strips primarily by Syvertsson, who is a Swedish creator. And it's basically, a series of autobiographical strips where Anna is, as a character, is going through just a variety of things, interacting with people, making certain observations. And sometimes these observations or these activities are quotidian. Sometimes they're a little more profound. But I call this more traditional in that here we have something more like an autobiographical strip narrative. And so we definitely have discernible stories among the various strips here. I mean, what did you think of Rule Break?
It reminded me a lot of Jillian Tamaki's Super Mutant Magic Academy, the webcomic version of it. She had specifically created that webcomic to practice her comics style, independent of her cousin, Mariko, whom she had, done so many comics with or had been doing comics with. And yet then it just took off because a bunch of readers loved it. And it became, obviously a print text eventually. But if you look at the very first entries, like the first 2 or 3 months of Super Mutant Magic Academy, it reminds me a lot of this. It's strips. It's drawn in a style that, it clearly looks like the coloring has been done with crayon or with pencil. And it's informal in that way, but they're all like small vignettes where you learn something quirky about a character or about a day, except, of course, this is autobiographical. And so in a lot of ways, it fits in nicely both with that, but also with a lot of women comics creators begin online with autobiographical comics. And this has definitely that feel. I think it fits into that. So yeah, this is a much more conventional comic, and a lot of the tropes that you would expect, like there's comics about her cat. Mm-hmm. A lot of times comics creators have cats, and those cats show up in the comic. And I don't know, it was just, in that respect, it seemed very familiar to me, to a lot of the comics reading that I do. So
yeah, exactly. And again, some of these strips are just about everyday observations, interesting scenarios. Like, for instance, I'm looking at one right now, and most of these strips are maybe at the most 1 page, but more times than not, about a half or maybe even a third of a page. So here's one that's a shorter one. It's called Barry. And it's basically, my friend Barry, who is a plant, is dying. He's some kind of small pine tree thing. I think he wants to be outside and free with his pine tree friends. But he's my friend now, so he's going to die. And some of these stories do have kind of a darker turn to them. On the other hand, sometimes they are kind of fun and just flamboyant, because there's this one pager, and this doesn't have a title, but we see Anna, who is wearing a top with a little peekaboo window, and it says, haha, this top with a great boob window is great. And I barely even have boobs, and she's dancing around. And then the very bottom, not even a panel because it's not in a line, but the image is a window to nothingness. So there are little things like that. So we do have these shorter strips, but then I think occasionally there are like a couple of these. There are longer strips that go on for several pages. And I think one of the most prominent of which is one called Bronball. And we get a little note here. that Brandball is a Swedish version of baseball or softball, pronounced like the name Brun plus bowl without the W. It literally translates to burn ball. And it's about Anna's experience not really enjoying Brandball in school, but then being recruited to play Brandball with a group of her friends who are dressed as in costumes of like superheroes. And most people aren't really taking the game seriously or aren't doing much about the game. And one of the big confrontations in this story is with a guy from her school that she had, I guess, been a rival Brandball player called Andrew Anderson. So Andrew Anderson becomes prominent, especially in the last part of the story. So, most of the stories are shorter in nature. That's one of the longest ones. And I do think that this is one of the more conventional texts in that we are dealing with strips that are more observational, situational, something that we would recognize, again, maybe not on the level of like a Dilbert or anything like that, but not too far off. And I think that the Tamaki reference that you made is a good one.
Well, the dry humor she has, like in the series called My Friend Visits Sweden, where her friend Daryl has never seen snow before. And she basically sends him off on this, what she calls this tiny little butt patch, which looks like something no bigger than a shovel handle, down this huge hill. And she's saying, like, watch out for the river. Oh, he'll be fine. And it's just, so she has a very wry sense of humor. And I like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And then we have, I think, other texts that you could argue, I mean, they're longer stories, but they're more, I don't want to say more conventional, but at least more discernible in terms of a storyline. And one of the books that strikes me as the most conventional, let's say maybe outside of Rule Break, is Mackenzie Schubert's Salmon Run. Mm-hmm. Do you agree?
Yeah, and it's also one in which the illustrations and the panel placement and everything, they read much more like a conventional comic.
Exactly, yeah. And that's one of the reasons why I do think that this is probably, along with Rule Break, the most conventional of the batch that we're looking at on this episode. But it's nonetheless a fantastical premise. From what I can discern, you have shape-shifting salmon who become menacing, salmon who transform into these men who are armored, who then become threatening and who even attack the humans. And so when there is what do they call it? It's not a salmon run. It's like a wild run. Mm-hmm. Or something to that effect. That means that there is in the salmon, because this is basically a community that lives along a riverbank, and so they sustain themselves by fishing salmon. But at times when you have a wild run and you have these transformative salmon, or salmon hybrid, if you want to call them that, then humans like run and hide, or at least get ready to battle because they know that they're in for a fight, because the salmon, these transformative salmon, are going to attack. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the back of the book reads, an army of shape-shifting an army of shape-shifting plague. Oh, I can't even read. An army of shapeshifters plague a local salmon run, stealing villagers from the banks of the river to join their ranks. When Mira loses her brother, she must set out on a magical quest few dare would make, pursuing the salmon upstream to save her family. And, as the blurb at the back suggests, Mira does become the protagonist, and she's this young woman. She thinks she has lost her father. And I say thinks she has lost her father because we learn some things toward the end of the narrative. But her brother is not as swift as she is. And he ends up getting caught up with the shape-shifting salmon, and they take him away. She goes to save him, and she learns some things along the way. And so that's basically the gist of what we have going on here. But I mean, there's more to the story than just that bare bones synopsis. I mean, I do think, as you said, that this is the most conventional in terms of not only story, but panel layout and what we normally think of when we think about comics. Because, when we see something like 310 or Stages of Rot or even Yuri on the Evangelion, they're comics, but they're comics in a different way that I think most of us are used to. Salmon Run, I think, would be recognizable to the vast majority of comics readers.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it because I read that after it was set up on the PDFs we were sent right next to The World, which I know is an earlier comic. But The World is set up very much by someone who I think is probably a big-time gamer. And basically you get all the protagonists at the beginning. And then what happens in the comic is that these protagonists you're given their qualities in battle, and then they have an actual ballad, battle. The World is by Valentin. I believe it's Seishi. I'm probably not saying it correctly. I'm sorry, Valentin. I apologize. But, that's a comic where basically you're given some characters, you know what their strengths are, and then you watch them interact in this world, this battle. Whereas in, Salmon Run, it was very much a narrative that had a beginning, a middle, and an end. It was a transformative experience for the protagonist. There's all these philosophical discussions about love and what people love and whether they love people or whether they love things. I mean, there's a depth to it that I'm a little bit more used to in the narrative comics that I tend to read. Mm-hmm. So I think that if you are trying Peow and you want a comic that reads like what you're used to and you maybe want to dip your toe, because there are still a lot of really cool, fantastical things and a lot of really interesting choices about, say, panel placement and about figural placement within panels and that sort of thing. There's a lot of neat stuff going on in this comic, but it does feel a little bit more like a traditional comic.
Yeah. And you mentioned The World is an earlier text. I think that was published in 2015, if I'm not mistaken.
Very early in there. I think back when they were a Kickstarter company that's funded by Kickstarter mainly. So very early on. But again, I'm not denigrating that. I'm just saying it's a little bit different. Mm-hmm. And so Salmon Run was the one that I was looking at that it was easiest to flip through just because I didn't have to work quite so hard. Mm-hmm. But again, that probably is more a testament to my reading more. I mean, I read children's comics, and with some very rare exceptions, comics creators for children are trying to make things easy to understand or read. There's certain stylistic techniques that comics creators use when they're writing for children to increase comprehension. And so it actually was sort of an interesting experience for me to work through some of these comics because that was not what was in operation. And I actually had to work a little harder, which was enjoyable.
Another text that I think is, at least in terms of its storyline, fairly conventional, but in terms of its presentation, quite different, is Wei Wei Pang's Ripple. And I think one of the things that makes this more conventional is this is a detective story, right? And so with a detective narrative, you do have, I think, certain expectations in terms of storytelling, where there is a crime, there is the awareness of the crime, there is the attempt to solve the crime, follow various clues until we get to the very end. And we have something similar going on here, although the quote-unquote crime, so to speak, that we have is a missing person. And in fact, the young boy is a 13-year-old by the name of Luke Phelps. Mm-hmm. And he goes missing in this community, and his parents wonder where he is. And so they call the police. And the two police who take the case their last names are Pan and Kylie. And so Pan and Kylie, and to some degree, Pan even functions as a narrator to the action that unfolds. But what they do is they investigate They talk to neighbors. They talk to people who are walking in the neighborhood, like, say, a guy who was walking his dog. There is this grumpy old woman who has a particular fishing spot who apparently was arguing with Luke the day that he went missing. And so they talk with her. But they also, and then primarily, talk with Luke's friends from school. And then they learn the clues that way. And then, the mystery is eventually solved. But the thing that I mentioned earlier, that I think it's a conventional story, but it's presented in a little more experimental manner. It's really interesting in that one of the things that Pang does is map out a timeline. And so you have panels that are set alongside a particular time. So for instance, I'm looking at, and we don't have page numbers here, but when the detectives are questioning his parents, I think they begin at about 11:40, around that time, 11:36, they get to the house. And then at 11:46, they're talking with the parents about what they remember about Luke doing the day he went missing. 11:52, the parents go into detail. 11:59, they go into more detail. At 12:06, the detectives thank the parents for going into so much detail, so on and so forth. So much of the action is given a timestamp, right? So we get to see how long the detectives take in doing the kind of things that they're doing. Along the way, we also get textual commentary on what some of the characters are or what some of the objects that they encounter. So when they go to see Luke's friends, in fact, Luke's friends are kind of hanging out in the woods, and they're talking about something. And there's something secretive, but they're not exactly sure. Detectives aren't exactly sure what they're referring to and if it may have something to do with Luke. So, we get a background information of the kids. So for instance, at one point, and again, we don't have any pages, they are looking at the character Ray, who is 12 years old, a girl who's 12 years old. And then we have a description of her profile. Her name is Ray. She's age 12, average height. Her eye color is brown. And she's defined by, I guess, her saying, "We spent some time together after school, but is he okay?" So we get a quote that, she gave the detectives. And then we get a view of her from different angles. And we get this for the other kids too, that they end up talking to. So it's like we get not only the story, but we also get the various details in the information that the detectives themselves would be noting.
And what's really weird is all of a sudden some of the people that they're interviewing are animals.
Yeah.
It's like this fisherman who looks like a cat and this person pushing a baby buggy who looks like a dog. This book, do you remember, I think you and I reviewed Nick Drasno's Beverly.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
This reminds me of like a sort of Drasno-esque sort of rendition of The Suburbs and of sort of the if you look at the way that characters are introduced and the way that they often are the only thing in a panel or just, there's a big close up on faces. It reminds me a lot of Beverly, actually. It's like,
yeah. And, one of the things that's kind of weird at the end is, and I don't want to give away the very end, how the mystery is solved, but they're questioning Ray. The detectives, Pan and Kylie, are questioning Ray at one point, and Ray claims that Luke walked into the river, to the lake, and then exploded into a ball of light. And the detectives don't know what to say to that.
Right.
What do you mean he exploded into a ball of light? Now, I will say that that's not what happened, but it's just kind of weird that that's the story that Ray gave. And they have no explanation as to why Ray said what she did. But there's another explanation as to what happened to Luke. So we do get that at the end. So even though that's kind of a conventional type of story, the way that it's told is definitely a little more experimental.
And it reminds me a lot, if you watch mysteries, it reminds me a lot in some ways of Vera. It's like the setup, the way that you see some characters acting suspiciously, but you're not sure what they're talking about or whatever. And then later on it's revealed, and then the detective's notes and all of that. It definitely has the feel of like a detective show. I really love the drawings. They're mainly charcoal, it looks like, and definitely great color palette. And I don't know, it was just like the detective's notebooks, everything in chronology. I just found that charming. It was really it was like you said, it's a much more conventional comic, but still like out there, and then like where I guess people are living with animals, and it's just, I don't know, it's interesting. There seems to be in every one of these comics something that just kind of makes you stop and go, you know, and that maybe is what the unifying characteristic is. Right.
And then another, I guess, somewhat conventional text that we have here is the recently Ignatz Award nominated Hot Summer Nights by Freddy Carrasco. And this is a short comic, and in essence it's what these three young boys are doing the night before they have to start school. So this is, you know, the last night of the summer, and so they're just hanging out, and it's basically what they're doing. And they don't do a lot. They skateboard and they roll a joint. They don't have a lighter, and they attempt to talk to a couple of, I don't know if they're Korean, but they're Asian girls or women, young women, who are smoking. So they ask for their lighter. And that's basically it. So basically you have these three youth who are just hanging out right before the school year begins and just trying to make the most of their evening.
Yeah, and at the end, there's this little poster-like thing. Labor Day weekend, doors open at 5 p.m. till sunrise, skate till late. You know, and it just, I would call this comic more atmospheric.
Yes, I think that's a good way of describing it.
You know, it creates a certain atmospheric feel of both boredom, but also freedom, and that's about to come to an end. You know, right. and so it was a really interesting little comic in that respect. It just reminded me, the place was so forward in this. So I think that what happens is you learn a lot about where these kids live.
Right, exactly, and it's in black and white. And it's interesting, you mentioned that poster at the very back. You know, it's only with that poster that we learn the name of the three youth who are, I guess, the protagonist of this story. Paul Silas, Benny Two Pennies, and then Shake.
Yep. I'm just laughing the way you keep on calling them youths. The two youths.
The two youths. Yeah. You know, but then we have Junky. And I think that's the most recent release of the ones that we're looking at. And this one just recently came out.
Yeah, it's interesting. And actually what I found to be quite useful is there's an interview right at the beginning of the comic with the comic's creator. And it's I believe, Guillaume. Okay, Singelin?
Guillaume Singelin.
Guillaume, yes, I hope we're doing that correctly. And it's all about his influences and what he sort of the comics that he read when he was growing up, what interested him, why he wanted to live in Japan to get a better understanding for Japanese comics. And the comic starts off with a bunch of sketches, and it's fascinating because you're kind of trying to get an understanding of what's going on, and then every so often in typeset he will tell you what's going on. And so this first part, there's a bunch of sketches of two people on a motorbike, and he says this is part of the same story as the cops. Most of the time when I start to draw some kind of little universe, I stick to it. I work a lot on the same thing. So with this story about the zombie guy, I try to think more of the story about these two cops, and I think about some kind of all people become crazy in the city. So I imagine some guy burning, and he was so crazy, so he is still walking in flames. The city gone crazy, and these two cops have to manage with this. And then you see all of these sketches, and something unfolds, and then there's pictures of other characters and descriptions of why he's drawing them. And so these are little vignettes, essentially, that have subheadings and lots of sort of exploratory text. Mm-hmm. It was interesting.
Yeah, the majority of the text is a series of sketches and these comments, as you mentioned.
And I think it's the kind of comic that, and I say this as someone with a limited attention span, that you can go and look at for a while and read through and then put it down and then come back and read through more. It definitely has a feeling of a pastiche as opposed to a really carefully plotted narrative. I think it's just a collection of sketches and ideas, and I found it, to be interesting. I didn't finish it all, I will admit, Derek, because I was under some time crunch. But I found that the interview at the beginning really helps to ground what's coming subsequently, I think.
Yeah.
So don't miss that, because a lot of times I know people will jump right in and they just want to read the narrative. But I would encourage people to read the author's note, because I think or the interview, because it's really, I think, illuminating.
So there we have it, our publisher spotlight on Peow Studio. We looked at quite a number of texts. We discussed Patrick Crotty's Internal Affairs, Ripple by Wei Wei Peng, Rule Break by Anna Syvertsson, Dustpan by Tran, Salmon Run by Mackenzie Schubert, Stages of Rot, Linnea Sterte, Hot Summer Nights by Freddy Carrasco, 310 by Mushbuh, I like to say that. Mushbuh. Devil Maybe Cry by Patrick Crotty. Also by Patrick Crotty, Yuri on Evangelion. Dark Angels of Darkness by Gofa. And Junky by Guillaume Singelin. And again, we're probably butchering that name. We apologize. But there are a lot of text there. And if you want to check out what Peow does, then go to their website. It's Peow Studio, PEOWSTUDIO.com. And they have actually quite a nice layout, and you can see the various comics that we discussed and get copies of your own. And so help support a small press. They do really interesting things. That's Peow Studio. And if you want to find great prices on other texts, unfortunately, I don't think you'll find any Peow books there. But for other publishers, check out our sponsor's website, Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, and you are guaranteed to find incredible discounts every single month. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about our spotlight on Peow Studio. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can contact us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right. You can contact us by email at twoguys@comicsalternative.com, or you can get in touch with us individually. I'm Gwen at comicsalternative.com. Derek, how can people reach you?
Derek at comicsalternative.com. You can also find us on social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. So a lot of ways for people to get in touch with us, Gwen, and we do like to hear from you guys.
I'd like for someone to get in touch with us all of those ways simultaneously.
Yes, and kind of like do an overload thing.
That's right.
Yeah. Now, next week will be our preview show for September, so be sure to check back for that. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Gwen. See you soon.